and women are present, sometimes you really see the same level of salaries. And then we still have a gender gap, both in salaries and in pensions. And how this happens. Ozge mentioned COVID. It's a huge crisis that has taken all of us. And during the COVID, women were mostly affected. Why? Because they work in health sector, they work in education, and they were on the forefront of fighting with this pandemic. But also when we go to analyze these areas, we see that most of the principals in schools are men. Most of the directors of clinics are men. So women work in the lower paid level jobs, and they often do the hard labor. For example, we can also take the textile industry. And if we take into consideration all of these details, I think that we would all understand why is this important, and that we are far from being equal, and that we need to fight to have the same access for both men and women, boys and girls, and the same opportunities for choosing jobs. And this starts from kindergartens as well. So education is also important because we have a lot of stigmas in our society, norms which are not written anywhere, but they are deeply rooted in our hearts and in our minds, and they come from generation to generation. So from very little age, boys and girls are taught that they should strive towards typical types of jobs, and this is where the inequalities start. So I think it's very important to mainstream our societies, starting from early education, where we could teach boys and girls that they are equal, and that they shouldn't pick jobs that are typical for women or typical for men, because all men should be able to do whatever jobs they want to do. A great example about this is the STEM economies and IT industry, where we also have a lot of men, and it is just because girls were not taught to move to programming, for example, and go to electrotechnical universities. They were taught to go to pedagogical academies and languages. So they end up doing works in school which are lower paid, and that's how we end up with pension gaps as well. These are practical examples. I wouldn't like to talk about gender mainstreaming in a political way and what does it mean in terms of policies, just to explain to everyone, because I think we all deal in different areas, and just to explain to everyone why this is important and how all the people can benefit from what we are doing. I think that's enough for now. If any questions, I can talk about it later.
And thank you so much for the points you touch upon. I mean, and highlighting the importance of gender mainstreaming, and the importance of collecting data and evidence-based activism, and not only collecting data, but also gender segregated data as well. I mean, this is the importance of data to provide more information, and also the importance of, engaging in more, the importance of participation of local civil society organizations into the issue. So it's quite important. Then thanks a lot for this contribution. I would like to continue with Daniel Kalazic from IRA, from the perspective of LGBTI plus rights, please.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. I'm happy this morning to be able for the very first time to participate to any event as a newly elected co-director of the ERA. For those who don't know, ERA is the biggest LGBTIQ network in the region. We are covering Montenegro, Serbia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Croatia, Slovenia, Kosovo, Albania, North Macedonia, and Turkey, gathering together 80 LGBTI organizations, mostly grassroots and service providing LGBTI organizations, or almost all of them in the region. I'm so happy to participate here today because DG NEAR actually had extremely important role in establishing of ERA, because we as a network are supported from the 2015 so on. So by the DG NEAR, by the European funds, and that allowed us as a movement to build one huge, strong and very well functioning network in this region. So regarding the human rights of LGBTI people, especially in this COVID and post-COVID, if we can say that yet that we are in the post-COVID time, there are many things that are still going on that are not new. As you know, we have in all of the region that we are working in high level of homophobia and transphobia. I would say misogyny, because it's basically the root of homophobia and transphobia. And that's one huge common problem in this region. Hate crime, hate speech, discrimination, mostly non-adequate legal framework. We have different country contexts, we have different problems regarding that. We are on the different levels from country to country, but overall situation is not good. We have lack of cooperation with public authorities, I would say, in most of the countries, adequate cooperation, and also lack of capacities of most of the LGBTI organizations to actively participate in the EU integration processes and decision-making processes. During these 2 years, from one, in most of the countries, unfortunately, not in Turkey, but in most of the Western Balkan countries that we are working in, we had before the COVID situation that we was working a lot, and we was having huge results, I would say, like that, especially regarding the improvement of the legal framework. But then COVID came, and COVID changed everything. First of all, COVID changed realities of LGBTI persons, because I believe that was also the problem with the women, with most of them. For the LGBTI persons, we had a situation that before the COVID, a lot of persons from the community in the region left their primary families because of the violence. And then COVID came, and the economical consequences of the COVID, and lots of people lost jobs. And after that, they were forced to go back to their primary families, and they were forced to go back in the violent environment. So the first thing that we had as a problem that escalated in March 2020, most of the countries in a few days, is increased family violence, domestic violence. And most of the LGBTI organizations were had to adapt to this situation. And most of us find a way to do so. But we had another situation that most of the donors didn't want to react or to allow us to use current funds and funds for the current projects for that purpose. It was urgent need. So we was really struggling to respond. And there are only few donors who actually told us, okay, tell us what you need, and we will make a new agreement, and you can use these funds for that purpose. So my recommendation is to DGNIR and to all of the donors that might hear anything from this event to be more flexible and to respond on the needs of the communities, not only on the LGBTI community, but all of the communities that are in disadvantaged position. We had another situation that is related to that during the COVID and after the COVID, that most of the donors, because of the new situation and now because of the war in Ukraine also, decided to change their priorities and focus. So we have serious decrease of the funding and support to the LGBTI initiatives and women rights also, I would say, in the region, in the whole region that ERA is working in. So our recommendation can be that future donor policies should be double checked with the organizations on the ground, with the grassroots organizations, and that all of the donors should make sure that their donor policies are responding to the needs of the communities on the ground. We had a lot of success in the previous year, especially in the Western Balkans, on the human rights of LGBTI people. So we need additional support in order to make sure that we will not go back. All of the organizations and communities. This is especially important because now we are witnessing a situation in which anti-gender movement is on the rise in the Western Balkan. Anti-abortion movement is actually more and more active. It was active in Croatia. It started being active in Serbia some time ago. And now, since the last month, they started being active in Montenegro also. Of course, in most of the countries, they are influenced or led by the church. And the church have mostly unlimited funds. I know from my work, and I'm working in the region for 15 years now, not only in Montenegro, but also in the region, that we do not have capacities to respond adequately, and we do not have funds to respond in an adequate way. Not only LGBTI organizations, but women organizations and all of others. I know that this is not a problem only in Western Balkans, it's also EU problem. We know what is happening in Hungary, we know what is happening in Poland, but we believe that this should be in the focus also. There are many priorities, many things that are important, but I'm afraid that if we do not pay enough attention on these threats, if we do not respond in an adequate way, that all of the success that we made together, because it's a success of all of us, can be in danger. So I would point out at this moment as a most important thing, how to respond on the threats. It's not only related to women or to LGBTI people. It's related to the direction of this region in a political way. We should see the bigger picture, I believe, because all of these movements, anti-gender movements, anti-LGBTI movements, anti-abortion or pro-life, however they call themselves, or however we call them, movements are not targeting us because of us. They are targeting us because they want to influence political reality in the Western Balkan or in the EU. So I believe that we should think about that in a that way, and I do hope so that we will all together be able to see that we will be in the future also supported, and that we will continue together with the DG NEAR and European institutions, and we all together as organizations from this region to cooperate and to bring positive changes in the future. Thank you.
You're welcome, and thank you so much for this contribution. Now, I would like to continue with Adriatic Hasantari from Roma Active Albania.
Thank you very much, Oscar. A little amendment. We're not a grassroots youth organization, Roma Youth. We are much more than that. That doesn't say that I want to undermine the youth topic and the role the youngsters have in the future of humanity, but that we are the leading organization of the biggest network in the Western Balkans and Turkey that brings all together more than 65 local Roma organizations that is working on improving the situation of the Roma in this region, not only with mainly with the financial support from DG NEAR. I'm very happy that both Taxol Team 3 and DG NEAR D5 decided to have this event in person, because I so much miss this exchange in person. And I apologize for the colleagues in Zoom, but next time you should join as well. It's much more, it doesn't say that that teleworking doesn't work, but at some point when it comes to this big discussion, such as talking about guidelines and which has been discussed for years, it's very important we meet in person. So thank you to those who thought that I could give a contribution to this meeting, and I can. In 2019, we were having various events around and focusing and not often not running from an event to another, not often understanding why we were there, but we had to be there. That was our life in 2019. In 2020, everything was threatened, and we went into individual shells, and we got scared, and it was very difficult to think, to work, to engage. But what it was not really visible is that the most marginalized groups were starving. The most marginalized groups was not a change from reality. It was a battle for surviving. When countries had lockdown across the region and not only across Europe, and like in any other crisis, Roma are the first to be hit. Roma are the first to suffer. And having said this, I don't want to bring a competition who from the groups is suffering the most, but really highlighting some of the elements that we did raise the alarm among the donor community and governments, that if the support will not go among the local Roma communities, we would have witnessed a human catastrophe in the region. What we witness on the other hand, and what we try to do, we try to fill the gap across the links with government, whether national and local government, because obviously everyone, including everything, was unprepared to deal with such a crisis, to deal with such a huge pandemic that will take everything from you, including the thinking and including the tranquility you might or might not have. So imagine all those people who live in pocket of ghettos, who works on informal or jobs that didn't benefit anything from the package of the government or didn't have documentation, and everything was closed and there was no cash flow. How was important, on how could they survive if it was from the help of the civic society organization? And I know most of us at that time did step in from a normal role we have to focus on policy change and to focus on having a watchdog role. We embedded a more a service role and a more filling a gap when it was needed, rather than doing the classic advocacy, trying to hold the government accountable here and there. You are not doing your job, but rather than trying to fill that gap that was left empty. And there were several gaps across the region that both the national government and local government and international donors did not interfere. So if someone was on the front line during the pandemic, except from the doctors and nurses, were also the civic society activists, which is often under spoken, which is often not recognized. And even though also to be said that living a life as a civic society or working in an NGO, you live the most poor life, the most instability life, because you have to reorient and to run from project to project to make sure you secure enough human resources and make sure you go with the flow and continue to serve to the constituency that your mission is about. But then on the other hand, the marginalization which has been discussed and offered from many angles, including policymakers, academia, activists. It was, I personally, I doubt whether everything was brought by COVID, but COVID highlighted certain things on how successful we are and how quick fix we want to do the things. And within the marginalization of different communities, it's impossible to quick fix. You would need to focus on a process that will save lives gradually but surely, but also engage the communities into a meaningful and empowering experience for their life. Having said that, the region, which I know best because for some years I'm working in the region, it is a paper reality. We have some of the best documents because for different reasons, different project, quite very interesting and ambitious project, our government or our institution have adopted a lot of nice policies, a lot of nice laws, which are implemented semi or at all. But if they are all implemented or if they are all taken care, the situation will change drastically. We're not there yet. And COVID did brought some side back. And we should always remind that progress would never achieved once and for all. We need to fight for it. And when it comes to Roma inclusion, there were certain elements that were changing in the region, such as in education, especially in policy leverage, in engagement, partly in participation. But then suddenly COVID wiped out everything. And then the governments in particular said, we have everyone in need now. Because one reason was because they didn't know how to deal with it. And the other reason is that no one knew how to deal with it. So therefore, without finishing the crisis, then there are several crises around it. And also sometimes an issue what was mentioned yesterday in the plenary by Nadir, the amount of reforms, which is here in the room, the amount of reforms being taken or being engaged or reworked in the Western Balkans and Turkey. On my personal opinion, these reforms often are abnormal for small countries. And what we don't see when it comes to the reforms is that the reforms will give their effects after the decade. So we don't know if those reforms are right or wrong. So we don't have the learning. We have a bit of assessment on where should it go, but the way most of the reforms are happening across the countries are leaving the most marginalized groups, including Roma, behind. For instance, digitalization. There is a trend now that it was also imposed by different actors and factors that everything is going digital. And this brings huge concerns and huge problems with marginalized groups, and in particular Roma, on how to navigate and how to deal with it and how to engage and how to, there's a lot of needs for capacity building. In capacity building, it's not a classical capacity building. You collect some people in this room and you tell them, you do this and you do that, and this is A and this is B, but it has to, it's a process that it's engaging, and it is also bringing devices, and it's also bringing means in order to use it. And often answer we hear across the region is that that's a global problem. You know, digitalization is a global problem. But then, sure, it is a global problem, but in some of the countries, it is really an issue that would jeopardize not only whether you are able to use it, but will also overstretch your rights in it. Another challenge or dilemma is that in this beautiful region we are, is that most of the rights are perceived as services. So human rights are perceived as services. And while that's the wrong thinking behind it, because services are and should be, are very basic, you need to have them. And the rights are not changeable and not, and you already take them by many laws and constitutions, while the services might change, might become innovated, while the rights still remain. And often, when we have the services, or when we have semi-access to services, we think that we have the exercise of the human rights. Another issue when it comes to Roma, it's the addressing the anti-Gypsyism, that is the specific racism towards Roma and Sinti, being stigmatized in public imagination as gypsies. And this is the one of the root causes of the social exclusion. And it was said in the beginning from one of our colleagues that marginalization, it's not having equal access to basic services, while type of marginalization we see among Roma, it's not having access at all. And it's very visible in a Roma neighborhood. You would see there's no streets, there's no sewage system, there's no electricity, there's no nothing. And it's not because there's a deep poverty. It's because this anti-Gypsyism attitude often of the government and institution. Because anti-Gypsyism, it's not only the perception, it's not only if you say something, it's not only if you do if you do action or if you don't do action. So the fact that there are no action around it, it makes the government not engaging or bringing the right response. Something we also need to bear in mind often is that we have a tendency that not only among CSOs, but globally, we react towards things. We don't focus on lessons learned because also we're living in such an unprecedented times. You know, there are multiple crises, the one start, another one, then there's another one in horizon, and we always react to this. We don't prepare strategically on having a know-how on how we deal with it. And I think it's time that the world would need to learn on how to deal with multiple crises, but also on how one crisis should not overshadow the other one. And that's a message not only towards civic society colleagues, but in particular to the decision makers and the donor community on why we need to manage multiple crises and why it's important that priorities are not shift. And I'm close to my statement, so thank you very much. I also wanted to touch on climate change, but
I think we can make another round during question and answer session. And thanks a lot for this very, very important contribution. And so policy development does not necessarily address the public institutions or government, but also the society as well, and the civil society organizations as well. So we need to discuss this intersectionality issue, not only in terms of the policy development or policy recommendations towards the governments or public institutions, but also the civil society organizations as well. And thanks a lot for this contribution. So I would like to continue with Samir Omer Efendic now.
Thank you very much, Özge. Jertik, I would give you my 5 minutes if necessary. So, thank you. Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak up on our experiences on behalf of UNDP and the Regional Program on Local Democracy. Before this meeting, I talked to Özge and we discussed, basically, she asked me to kind of explain highlights of the good cooperation between civil society and local governments. However, we discussed maybe just the idea to pose the question what the cooperation is. How do we perceive this cooperation between civil society and local governments? We could have seen yesterday in the guidelines that cooperation is perceived as a way that civil society contributes or partake within the policy development processes, enacting bylaws, participating in that. So that's one part of it. It's also monitoring of the work of the government. Should be part of the cooperation, which usually governments do not like to fund. However, it's also cooperation is related to funding. It's related to money. Huge aspect of the work in local communities is related to what civil society does with regards to service delivery, basically providing projects that are bridging the gaps within their own community. So all of this, at least in my perception, relates to cooperation, and many other aspects we can discuss, more or less tangible, however we define it. So what we do within the regional program on local democracy, I will just briefly pitch a project in 30 seconds so you understand the scope of our work. We have one segment of the work is related to supporting local governments to increase their public spending. So the segment related to budget spending foreseen for civil society organizations should be more transparent, inclusive, etc. So what we do, we have a tool, methodology, train local governments, ask them for adoption of these bylaws, and basically teach them how to do this process in a more inclusive and transparent way. Here we make a big game changer, which is asking to include civil society into decision-making process. Starting from the deciding what are the key priorities in this local government are, to the level of when the final decision and evaluation process is done. On the other side, we also work with civil society organizations, providing them with grants, but also equipping them with skills to properly implement the projects. Basically, often we all notice that the grassroots level organizations, they often cannot handle issues within the log frame. They don't know how to report, how to do proper procurement to make it transparent, etc. So we need to be aware of these things. Throughout the Reload program in past 4 years, we have, just to give you the size of the program that is implemented in all Western Balkan 6. We implemented almost 500 small-scale projects in more than 50 local governments. All of these projects were related mostly to service work, to the needs of mostly marginalized groups and those that are in need. So the way it's done, priorities are defined within the derives from the strategic document of local governments, but also through public discussions where we invite civil society to have a say. So when we speak of the highlights when it comes to cooperation between local governments and civil society, good cooperation is a two-way street. Local governments often do things by law. They have to do public consultations, they will invite, but it's very relevant for civil society organizations to be vocal, to participate, to argue and discuss the topics, priorities, and have their say. Often what happens, marginalized groups, there is no organizations to represent them, so they fall under the radar. And this is where grassroots CSOs, both formal and informal citizens, are relevant to say, because if you don't say it, it's not going to happen. And I was asked to provide some good examples, so I will do that. What happened in the times of COVID? There was a lockdown. People were at home, so we were. That was a different. We were lucky, probably. But our colleague from ERA mentioned that they were not able to transfer funds or use funds for COVID-related issues. We were lucky. We discussed with the European Union and focused some of our resources on the COVID-19 issues. How did we do it? So basically, we asked civil society organizations, but also our partner local governments, what are the urgent needs? So in several municipalities, we realized a lot of marginalized groups and their children, they cannot attend online schools because they didn't have access to internet, or they didn't have telephones or notebooks, whatever. So this is how we stepped in, but through the civil society organizations. I don't know what the needs are. Local grassroots CSOs, they know. So this is one of the very good examples in the time of urgency, how to respond. And we were lucky to work with partners that were able to deliver these things very quickly. I have very good examples to present you in each of the countries, but I'll just try to give you different examples so you get a grasp of what a good cooperation could be. For instance, in Bosnia and Herzegovina city of Zenica, we have a civil society organization called Medica. It's basically very prominent. Some of you probably heard of. They were first to develop a gender action plan in their city. Okay, municipality or city government was supposed to do that. It was their obligation by law. However, they haven't done it. So this CSO stepped in and did it. They include all other smaller actors within their area. And based on this good cooperation, City of Zenica recommended them to the cantonal upper level government to do the same. So they were providing services for something the government probably lacked. They didn't know how to do it. And I find this as a very good example. So they scaled it up. They went out of their scope of work, at least foreseen at that time. In North Macedonia, for instance, we have several projects where women that are marginalized or unemployed, for instance, in Commun, we had an example of women preserving certain crafts and then finally living out of these crafts. Or in Kavadarci, where young women were taught how to do organic farming, and then were assisted to basically their livelihood was improved. When it comes to more of policy work, just recently, city of Novi Sad, which is one of the largest urban areas in Serbia, when they worked with us, they realized that they needed office for cooperation with civil society. So their step in was, okay, we do want to improve this cooperation, and we don't have a certain institution or department with our city administration to do so. So let's do that way. So we are very proud of this. This is one of the good things. Or cooperation when it comes to services in the city of Nikšić in Montenegro, where the association assisting for persons with disabilities trained for several months, 10 plus beneficiaries to find their first job. Basically, they were employed within hairdressers to do that. Or in Albania, for instance, when women were empowered to start producing soaps, etc. So all of these things were, in my opinion, very good examples when it comes to the cooperation between local governments and civil society. There are many more, and you know all of these, and you probably can provide some maybe even better examples or more visible. But I really try to focus on those that are really serving the needs of local population. I'm not diminishing the other roles of civil society when it comes to monitoring, when it comes to policy work. This is also as relevant. However, what I see from the field, that mostly grassroots CSOs are dealing with service delivery, with the key issues that are important for their constituencies and their beneficiaries. And the most of our funds that we dedicate and award to civil society is related to different type of service delivery projects in their communities. Okay, I got a signal that I should closely finish this. These are the key highlights. But what I learned from the experience, and often I start speaking as an activist. I was a part of civil society before. In the 90s, when you know, in the post-war era of Bosnia and Herzegovina, I was a youth activist, and we organized the first youth fairs in one part of the countries, which was a sort of a security challenge at the time. And we always asked the government to do something for us, and we were kind of yelling that they should do something, and it didn't work. It really didn't work. Now I see young people leaving because that didn't work. And the other day we were on the conference when they did pretty much the same. I really felt much younger seeing these youngsters talking, but basically using the same narrative. And I was really honest telling them that it's not going to work. We tried, our generation tried, and it didn't work. We had to fight for this, not only be vocal. You have to take into the fight with the government to get what you want, what you think you deserve, and then you will get the most out of it. However, I also see that there is certain progress. So we have to be realistic. We might be impatient when it comes to different democratic processes on a local level. But if you go back, there is an improvement. Yeah, I am impatient. I want to live in Bosnia and Herzegovina that will have human rights protection and freedom of association and gatherings like in Sweden. But it's not going to happen. However, the situation when compared to late 90s, it's much better. So I think in the region, it's also much better. And this is why I always leave room for optimism that despite of these challenges that we talk, we have to remain optimistic and keep working, because this is what's going to keep us going and provide us better future. Thank you.
And thank you so much for this contribution, and for sure the best way of producing more effective policies is the ensuring the inclusion of the subjects of the issue into the decision-making mechanisms. And thank you so much for this contribution. Now I would like to continue with Mr. Nafi Saracini from EU delegation to North Macedonia. Can we please also use this microphone?
It's working. Okay, thank you. Okay, it's my turn now. So I was listening carefully all the presentations so far, and I grabbed a few words which I think I will like to use for what I'm planning to say. It is one of the speakers said that EU assistance, I guess also other donors, should be more flexible and should be more targeted to the needs of the final population that they are targeting. But also it was mentioned here that services are more and more present in the activities that are implemented by civil society organizations. As I was introduced, I really have quite a long experience in managing projects, mainly grant schemes, action grants that were dedicated to support or to fight against discrimination or to help in inclusion of indigenous people, inclusion of Roma, inclusion of people with disability. And after so long time working on these projects, it's one of the most legitimate questions that I'm posing to myself, but also my donors are posing as well. The donors are, all donors and my bosses are posing is, what are the effects of how much we really managed with all this assistance to impact and to create a change to the final beneficiaries of all this assistance. Because if you take from one side the statistics and numbers of invested resources, money, time, and work of donors and also of many NGOs, but not only NGOs, is enormous, and versus the effects that are we can witness today, I don't think there is. I think that there is a kind of big discrepancy. I will more plastically present this on our recent experience with assistance that we provide to Roma community in the country, and which is part of the social assistance, of course, but also we have a separate program dedicated only for Roma with separate budget that considers only issues related to Roma. And we know that Roma community is unfortunately affected with all types of human rights problems, exclusion, all issues related to inclusion and exclusion activities. So in that sense, in the last 15 years, when we were discussing with our counterparts, usually some Roma political parties, but also government representatives, very often we were being asked whenever we presented that, for instance, we invested in IPA 1 about 7 million euros for Roma inclusion. We have been asked what happened, where this money went. In some other occasions, of course, whenever we visited Roma settlements, which are in very bad shape, of course, and discussing with some Roma NGOs, we have been also asked about these questions, where this money went. Of course, there is always answer to these questions, of course, that the money was channeled in proper way. But the question that is challenging me after all these years working is, why this question, and ask what is actually happening? We decided in that time to do one step further and to engage an external expert to make a kind of evaluation and assessment of all investments that we had in the period from 2004 to 2020 related to Roma inclusion. The experts' result was quite interesting because it was done with many interviews, many discussions, many policy analysis, documents analysis, and it came with, I will just give you a short conclusion of what was a result of that assessment, is that all the activities that has been implemented so far, mainly through civil society organizations, are focusing on something that we could call preparation phase, in something that is related to assessing the needs, in something that is related to organizing systems, organizing civil society organization, building capacities of civil society organizations, and organizing workshops, seminars, but not directly targeting the final population. Therefore, we still have now in the country, for instance, in Macedonia, we have about 700 Roma, maybe more, who are without documents. We have still children begging on the street. We have still largest number of Roma unemployed. We have Roma women which are without education. Lately, our latest statistical are showing us that the number of illiterate people in the country is enormous, about 2.7%, which I assume a large part of them are Roma. So comparing to what has been resources investing, a bit, it's questionable, and to see where we made, or is there any mistake, or what was wrong, what was not properly planned, and what could be improved. I'm saying this not in order to criticize one or the other side, because I think that on both sides, on the donor side, but as well on the civil society organizations, there is a part that probably doesn't went well, or some activities that probably are not well planned in order to directly address the needs of the targeted population. EU assistance is basically, when it comes to Roma, but also on other sectors, is focused on assistance to institutions, meaning that we support the central, local government institutions and other institutions in state related to human rights, related to employment or market development, to increase their capacities in order to enable a system which is going to be compatible, of course, with the European member states, and system that will enable a better inclusion of the group that is disadvantaged. On the other side, we have also assistance to civil society organizations, because we consider that through civil society organizations, we can kind of in the fast track come closer to the needs, real needs, the daily needs of disadvantaged groups. And civil society are those who are organizations that in the best way know how to address those needs and will propose activities that will address those needs. I did additional step yesterday evening by using the data that we are having in the management of our programs in the delegation. I made a kind of assessment of about 50 projects that in the last 10 years has been invested in through civil society organizations in addressing the issues related to gender discrimination, related to human rights, issues related to inclusion of people with disability. Of course, this is not a scientific assessment. I did it very quickly, but what I noticed is that most of the activities that has been proposed in the 90% of these projects, and there were about 70 projects that I checked, had something which was called public awareness building, meaning that they organized kind of preparation of videos, brochures, public awareness documents, and various types of activities that could raise the awareness about the problem that they are going to target to the wider public. This word of wider public is very often used, meaning that they want to target the whole population of the country, which of course is something which could be discussed. About 70% of those projects that I was checking the activities, they had activities related to workshops, trainings, seminars, training of people from government institutions, training of judges about human rights, training of, I don't know, other types of institutions related to law enforcement about becoming more sensitive about the issue that the project is targeting. About 50 to 60% of the project's activities were related to networking, creating of network between NGOs or creating of cooperation between NGOs, civil society organization, and municipalities or other state or non-state institutions. But only about 10% of the activities were activities related to giving concrete support or concrete service to the final target group, like free of charge legal advices or, I don't know, assistance to giving scholarships to disadvantaged groups, to Roma students, for instance, or people with disability, or providing some assistance in legalization of Roma homes. So I don't want to draw any conclusions from this, but all those activities that has been proposed, and of course, I'm not here undermining the role of the donors of our role as a delegation of European Commission, because we always in our guidelines for applicants, we give indications, we give the kind of ideas in which sphere the project should be and which field and the type of activities that should be, which sometimes give not always best orientation to and inspiration to civil society organizations to apply. On the other side, I always feel that there is a big lack of creativity among the proposals coming from civil society organizations in terms of being more oriented to activities that are not probably are more difficult to implement, meaning providing concrete services to the people that are in need. And when we speak about human rights, needs are kind of urgent because needs are here today, there. I mean, people are suffering every day. It's not changing of the institution systems where we all know that it takes a long time to change the system or to change the government and to increase the capacity of government institutions. But when we speak about human rights and inclusion, I think we should have a bit different focus and different approach to the problems that people on the daily basis are investing. So my time is gone. Okay, so I hope I mentioned few issues that will attract now discussion, and I'm here to reply.
Thank you so much to all of our panelists, and thank you for your understanding for me to keeping the time. Now we can move on to question and answer sessions, but before that, I would like to give another 2 minutes to Adriatic, because he would like to mention this climate change issue as well. I also think that you also have a comment. Okay, then. If you agree, we can continue until 10 past 11, since we started 10 minutes late. If it is okay.
Thank you. I have comment on your it is okay the donors are assessing projects. It's quite good, but I believe that all of us knows that, especially from the civil society, that we are directly guided by the calls of proposals, priorities, and exactly. So I'm not commenting your intention in any way, but I must share a feeling that all of the things that you said were something like transferring responsibility for not having success to a civil society organizations, or blaming us. In a way, I'm quite open always, with my comments without any intention to fight about anything. So I have more things to say. So there is a trend from many donors that I identified that we are not creative enough, that they are not satisfied. The donors want some new things, new activities. And I will share an example from when I was in Quir, Montenegro, in the middle of COVID. We sent the project proposal to the Council of Europe for the urgent response to the communities that are affected by the COVID. And there were only one need for 1,000 of our clients: food, paying of rent, utilities, and that's it. So we have sent a project proposal with basic things that people were asking from us, people who were without job, without money, without anything because of economical situation. And the project is rejected with the comment that we were not creative enough. We cannot be creative in many situations, because if we want to respond on a need, it is quite clear to us, to all of us who are serving to the communities, what we should do. If we, in many occasions, if we want to be creative, whatever that means, because nobody explained us ever what means to be creative, then we should do things that will not respond to the needs of our communities. We can discuss about results. We can discuss about impact, about everything. It is good to discuss. It is good to rethink. But if someone is not satisfied with the result, we can maybe sit together. We can talk about different approaches. Yeah. And we also, I believe, always must have communities, representatives of the communities at the table and talk directly with the needs. Because I know that in many occasions, donors are communicating with themselves about donor policies. We are not invited, or we are invited on the presentation or on a consultations that are actually not consultations, because the most of the work is done. Donors decided. I believe that the new approach should be, let's sit all together, because this must be collaboration. If we want to bring a real change, let's sit all together. Let's discuss about everything. Let's agree, and let's start working. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And yeah, please.
Okay. So
that, I will give you the
I'm
floor.
sorry if you understand me wrong, that I'm trying to blame somebody. I'm just trying to give the information that from the evidence and the check that I did. So you are right for many things that you said, but be aware that most of NGO, civil society organizations, are somehow demand, they are not demand driven actually, or supply driven. Whenever there is a call, most of them, they adopt to the call, regardless that maybe activities of this organization are not in the scope of the call of the proposal that is coming, or whatever. They want just to apply, because of course they need to have projects. I mean, I'm not saying that that is wrong or right, but again, telling you what is the situation reality. And I don't think that, of course, donors, there are two ways of implementing any project that you receive to satisfy the donor. And maybe very often, as you mentioned, that is not going in relation to the needs of the people. But I think that your proposal and your activity should start from the needs of the people, not from the needs of the donor. So when it comes to the guidelines that we already mentioned, of course, guidelines are orientation. Of course, you have to also, I'm not, again, now trying to protect donor side, but donors, of course, have the information, and we are basing our grant schemes on the collected information, or the strategies, on the discussions with civil society. I mean, we should not be, at least when it is about European Commission, I'm sure that there is always a wide process of consultation before any grants has been published, and is based, of course, none of the grants can satisfy all the needs of the whole grantees. But again, it is not, the guidelines are not there just to tell you that you should do what is written in the guidelines, because always the teams are giving you just an idea about which direction you should go, based again on the needs on the group that you are presenting. And most of the mistakes that most of civil society organizations are trying to think too big with small amount of the grant that they are receiving. I mean, whatever activities they do public awareness on national wide. They do activities to change the human rights in the country, generally. I mean, to improve, I don't know, the legislation, or to improve the whatever, the work of the ombudsman, which is not possible to be done usually with the scope of the activities that they propose, or in the capacity of that organization that is applying. So rarely I have seen grants that has been, or application that has been really focused on a concrete group, or the smaller group with a concrete problem, with concrete activities that will try really to solve the problem of that group, of that concrete group in the specific municipality. You don't have to be too big always.
Thank you so much. Okay, there are too many hands, so I would like to just give the floor to you first, and after that I will continue with Tanya, and after that Adriatic, and I will move on then.
Yes. Absolutely, very briefly, and my comment is also to Mr. Nafis. I agree completely that projects should not be donor-driven. Either organization should be donor-driven. But I mean, here I want to bring the question about funding modalities, and especially when it comes to EU funding modalities, in a way, how to support local, small grassroots organizations which cannot obtain EU funding, and in circumstances when there is no other funding, basically from other donors. So, I mean, that's something to continue discussing perhaps in the future. When it comes to your assessment about the different projects you mentioned, or different program you had to the Roma Inclusion Project, I mean, like I'm representing Finatil Kvina, who is also providing financial support to women's rights organizations, local women's organizations, many of them. And we often see the same tend to have projects where they go back to the same things, like assessments, capacity development, and so on and so on. But I mean, this again refers to the manner of support provided to civil society organization. And my note to EU funding, for instance, and maybe the reason why you see the same things going on over and over again is the short-term support provided through your projects, basically. If you provide follow-up support to a project that has been implemented for 1-2 years, you may not see the same things happening, you know, in the continuation of the project. First of all. Another thing, I mean, just a very brief example I will mention, like why we, for instance, have low capacity development over and over again. Like we see a lot of women's organizations working with capacity building of local authorities, for example. And we have to do it from the beginning every time, because every 4 years or less than 4 years after every local elections, we see local representatives changed. And we see like new representatives completely blank, where we have to explain from the beginning what is gender equality, what is local policy making, and so on and so on. And finally, I mean, when it comes to innovation and creativity, as my colleague said, when you have like very basic services missing on the ground, you can't really be creative. And we have great expectations on EU to push a bit more pressure on the governments, including the local governments, to take over their responsibility, you know, to provide services to people so that we as civil society can be more creative and work on more innovative and funny things. Thank you so much.
I think Emilia said most of the things I wanted to say. We work closely together and we are aware of the challenges that we face on daily basis when it comes to creating new programs and asking for funding. Just not to repeat what she said, there was one question, where does the money go? I would give an example of changing governments and participating to decision making and policy making through working groups and sectoral working groups. For example, we spent 2 years on working on a new law, which is then stopped because there is a change in government and then new people come in the government. So we have to start from a scratch and fight with them for the same topics to be introduced to the law for another 2 years. We have 5 or 6 very important laws, for example, in North Macedonia, stuck at the moment since 2019 or 2018. They were ready twice and never adopted. So again, the process is starting over and over again. Just a plastic example of what can happen on the way when you do things. When it comes to services, of course, COVID was mentioned, and there was really bad times for NGOs providing services who don't have time to write applications and ask for money because they are on the field and they are coping with victims of violence. When the state could not respond to citizens' needs, for example, I think Daniel talked about gender-based violence within the home, which was increased during COVID because of the lockdowns, and the state was not functioning. A reactor did an exercise then. We were checking the phone lines for SOS phone lines for victims. None of them was working, and there were victims calling CSOs. So in times like that, you can't be creative and you have to respond to these needs. But what Emilia mentioned, the types of funding are really important to respond to such needs. So instead of short-term and project-based, maybe operational and long-term funding can be one answer to move forward and to make better results. And of course, capacity building does not only affect our governments, but also our organizations, because sometimes we burn out and people leave us. And then we have new people who should be trained again and again and again. So these are topics like public awareness building, capacity building, and even general population. They shouldn't be narrowly understood, because influencing general population, we can't influence 2 million people or as much as we are in North Macedonia right now. But if we influence 1,000 people, for example, and we have a domino effect, these 1,000 people talk within their communities, then we can say that we are talking about raising public awareness and influencing general population. I know that the data that you mentioned are very important, and it's good that we should reflect on such data and try to improve both on the side of donors and on the side of civil society organization. And if we sit down together and discuss this data, I think it will be good to make our applications better in future, but also to organize better grant schemes. And I would only want to mention just one example, a recent example from participation to a monitoring IPA committee in our country. I didn't do that in the past, and my colleague who is usually doing this was busy, so I had to participate to a long monitoring committee for IPA 3 for the next year, 2022. Unfortunately, our government was not ready with the documents. They had many remarks by EU, and they were really on the right place. But there was one thing: CSOs were silent and told that they don't have time there is no time for the CSOs to react or give any advice, because it was a dialogue between the donors and the government itself. So we couldn't do anything in this respect. What Daniel said, we are silent observers, but not doers in this respect. So when the time comes, I think it was 6th of June, that all the action documents were supposed to be finalized for North Macedonia. And this has already, the deadlines has expired. And we really don't know what will happen, because the government wouldn't let us influence these action documents so that we can tell them what's important on the field. So I know that Emilia said EU should influence or push our governments. I know that that's not diplomacy. but still maybe a dialogue and probably asking for accountability for the funds given to a specific country can be useful as well on the government side. I'm not sure if we have governments here today, but it would be important to hear their voice as well.
Thank you so much. There's also one more comment online. I will also give the floor to Siazana. I saw it. But Adriatic, please.
Okay, thank you very much. I think it's great that you made those comments because you created a bit of debate, and I think one of the sort of the important debates here is the role of CSOs as such, and we're debating that also in Brussels at the headquarters. We know that CSOs work on service provision as well, and at the same time, you don't want to have CSOs having to fill a gap that should in work that should be done by governments. And that's a little bit why we have in our guidelines promoted instead this a role of CSO, which is for structural change. But at the same time, it's true that it's a lot of resources, and then you would also want to see concrete things happening on the ground, which is why we also do these projects like with Reload, where you do both. You work on the structural change, but you also see sort of concrete activities happens. But I think that's a debate that needs to continue. But I think the really important question is, how can CSOs be most effective in terms of really getting these structural changes in government affairs, which is what we're looking for, and in institutions and in sectors. And there was so much said, but I know other people want to talk as well. But I still want to say that we did a lot of work to be flexible when COVID struck. I think Michela Matuela mentioned some of that yesterday. There was lots of work on the big money, if you like, reprogramming big amounts so that we could support medical equipment, things like that. We also worked with our CSOs, the CSOs financed by us, and other projects to really see, especially those that really lended themselves to do quite a lot. Again, we worked with Reload, with the Romacted, which had a lot of people out in the communities, and we were able to provide a lot of kind of emergency support in this regard. And we did work with many CSOs to change the contracts that we have with them so that they would be able to do different activities as such. But all this is, of course, time that it takes. Okay, I'll leave the floor to other people.
Just in the line with what has said, that they're also for systemic change and for works on services, and mentioned Reload and Promacted. You also need to mention the size of grants they have. Yes. So the Reload, it's 10 million euro, and Promacted, it's 6 million euros. So you would have to combine it. The grant of CSOs, how much are they? You also need to look at this. Often these numbers do bring a change, do bring more resources to it. So I think often when we discuss, often the debate, it's not fair, and it was put the challenges or the sort of failures are put on the side of CSO, and then often we're asked we have to do more. But what is more? We don't, and Daniel already said, often we have a difficulties to understand what donors want, because most of the call are not clear in what they want. And if you run from a call to another, and if you run from the info session to another, also it's often this info session are ambiguous and not clear enough in understanding what you want. And of course, most of NGOs are donor driven, because most of the NGOs depend on donors. And we can say it should not, but that's a reality. You have to run from project to another. You have to look for potential donors that you have to engage and re-engage on the work. And I will conclude with a personal example. And I was going to everyone, all of us, we go to notary. I don't know how it is in other countries, that you go with the original document and you do a copy attestation of it, right? You call it, the recognition with their original. That's what it's called. So I go to this very noble notary who was overstressed, and I asked her, what's wrong with you? She said, after 30 years, I'm doing this this original, this recognition with original, and they said, I'm going to quit. And then I was like, oh, perhaps didn't went to the right notary. And then she said, but why you are here? And I said, well, I would need an attestation of the original. So of course there are a lot of frustration around, but I mean, some of the things are needed and they need to continue because they're needed. So we need to make sure what we want and what is innovative, but also that it's important, but also what is needed. And always what is needed bring always frustration among many people, but it's needed. Thank you.
Thank you. Quite interesting discussion. I was really impressed with the interventions from the first speakers, and I would want to go back to what actually was mentioned by Daniel for the abortion laws. We are all very well aware that we're living in a global crisis, and the global crisis are also utilized by groups to build certain narratives and implement different politics. How many of you are familiar with the Reddit as a platform for chatting and discussions? Reddit is like highly intensively bombarded by the right-wing groups where they promote misogyny. Most of them having this spiritual father called Jordan Peterson. And on the same time, we're talking here about whether we should support CSOs delivering trainings, or is it enough with trainings and we should do something else? So the moment where we live in, I don't want to be dramatic, but it is serious. The right-wing groups are flourishing all over, while we are remaining silent, using the very same tools as we were living in a normal, different circumstances, without actually being adequate to what's happening in reality. And to this end, the weakest groups, all those affected mostly by the so-called human rights, will always deteriorate. Now, going back to what Mr. Saracini said, very interesting views. And I would want to give my perspective. First of all, I'm Andrei Puka from Kosovar Civil Society Foundation. Among others, we also do re-granting and program granting schemes for civil society organizations. So in a way, I have that donor perspective also. When donors plan their funding schemes, they do have, for example, EU or bilateral states, embassies, they have those state goals that they want to promote in the region. But they are wide, like promotion of democracy, gender equality, education, and so on. And the next step is research, discussing with the locals, be that government representatives, civil society representatives, and others. And only then they come up with more specific objectives, from which then the call for proposal is drafted. I don't really, and I see this as a very good experience in the EU office in Pristina. The call for proposals are very well informed for all the studies and research that is done locally. And I don't believe that anything that is put in the calls does not relate with the needs of the communities, which brings us to the point that of this cliche of CSOs being donor-driven. What do we mean by donor-driven? Do we mean that donors are telling us what to do? Not really. We are together drafting those priorities, which then are publicly available to all of us, and we apply to get funding. The second point is actually one of the biggest mistakes when we talk about data that was previously mentioned. If we look at data very superficially, like a list of hundreds of projects, and we see training and training and training. Yeah, most of the projects do have training, but we should also dig deeper and see what's the use of the trainings. Do they have another purpose on that? If we talk about Roma, if we talk about other marginalized groups, then of course that education will be the most burning issue, the most needed area or field to intervene with activities. And if we, if you as a donor end up supporting hundreds of projects that do not really bring something concrete, then the failure is on your side, not to be blamed, not the CSOs, and we're not blaming here CSOs in general, but those the weakest in the links, the grassroots, the one working with marginalized groups. It is difficult to expect concrete results when we speak about human rights, when we speak about democracy, considering all the circumstances where we live in. It requires a lot of years to see a bit of an impact, a bit of change. And structural changes do not happen within a night. And especially they cannot be, they cannot entirely be expected by the grassroots or marginalized groups. Where is the state? Where are the donors? I know, but please, because even yesterday the discussion was stopped, and I think we need to discuss such thing. It is very important. Like if we need, we can extend for a bit longer, but we don't meet often, and too many important issues were raised, and I wouldn't really feel comfortable going out from this room with really blaming those who deal on daily basis with the marginalized groups. And what now I lost my thought train. Okay, so the thing is that actually what we need more is training and discussion, but not only for the grassroots, but for the more well-established CSOs, and including the donors. EU and all other donors apply and require the rights-based approach to be implemented in designing and implementing activities. The rights-based approach is not an easy task to conduct. At KCSF 3 years ago, we have integrated that within our calls for proposals, but it took us years and years to first to convince our donor partners that actually if you target a specific marginalized groups, you're not favoring someone, but you're just applying the rights-based approach. And then the other point, the most difficult one, was to actually integrate that in the criteria for applications. And now, only now, after 3 years or 4, we could realize that our beneficiaries are not the most well-established CSOs, but those who work with the constituencies who do support marginalized groups daily. So if there is a genuine interest, then it should be from both sides, and a joint effort should be put if we really want to see human rights as a prevailing issue, rather than blaming others or the weakest in the link.
Thank you so much, and sorry for that, since we are just running out of our time, and we also have one more comment, and we need to close down the session. And now I would like to give the floor to Siezana for one last comment, and after that we will close down the session. And thanks a lot again for all of your contributions. Siezana, please.
Yes, thank you, Özge. Again, fascinating discussion. I would like to reflect on 3 points specifically. One is, and I was quite surprised to hear that. I have to say I found it a bit disturbing that successful cooperation between authorities and civil society should be lumped into the service provision box. If civil society organizations are forced to provide services, it's because the states have failed in their duties, and they have failed in their human rights duties, and civil society organizations should not be expected or forced to provide services. And let me just give you one very brief example. When the government of the United Kingdom was violating the right of women to their bodily autonomy, the Family Planning Association of the UK was established to provide access to abortion. And then as the society evolved, as the National Health Service evolved, and as the laws evolved, eventually the Family Planning Association of the UK stopped providing abortion services and transferred their logistics and their operations to the National Health Service. and now the government provides this service, and there are no alternative. There are still some alternative providers, but the point is service provision is a human rights obligation of the government, not of civil society organizations. And Lotta, you said that, and the guidelines try to reflect that as well. And I think this is really important. Secondly, the comment about how CSOs lack creativity in their projects, I was also quite surprised about that. Unless they overpromise, they will not be successful. They are shackled into specific requirements for any given call, and now they're expected to be creative on top. If you really want them to be creative, give them core funding, and give them core funding at the levels which ensure sustainability, and you'll be amazed by the levels of creativity that civil society organizations will be able to achieve. And the final point is about impact. Again, I have, you know, we have a certain idea, but maybe not very clearly as to how impact happens, how change happens in a society. And it seems to me that we are laying down failures of every other actor with much more significant resources and authorities at, you know, in front of the CSOs. So again, how much impact can you realistically expect? Are you prepared to commit funding so that this impact can be achieved? Are you prepared to commit to supporting CSOs over time so that this impact can indeed be achieved? And can they be realistic? Can you be realistic, and can they be allowed to be realistic and honest about what they can achieve? You know, because again, if they don't overpromise, the project proposals will not be successful. They will not be deemed creative, and then we are back at square one. And also, I guess my other question is how much of any CSO impact is actually undermined by the donors' other policies, especially when donors are multilateral organizations and governments. So I think we need to be a bit fairer to civil society organizations when we say, you know, well, what is your impact, and what's the, where has all the money gone, and what has been the effect of that? Thank you.